Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes how the U.S. keeps funding Ukraine's military even as it says it's out of money, why the world should still worry about dirty bombs, China launched secret space plane as U.S. rival remains grounded, Taiwan's presidential candidates at loggerheads over submarines, brand new trains sprayed with rocks, shattering dozens of windows, how the U.S. keeps funding Ukraine's military even as it says it's out of money, Associated Press. The White House has been pressuring Congress to pass legislation to support Ukraine's war against Russia, claiming that funding has run out. However, President Joe Biden announced a new military aid package worth $200 million for Ukraine, raising questions about the availability of funds. There are two pots of money for weapons and security assistance specifically for the war in Ukraine. One is the Presidential Drawdown Authority, PDA, which provides weapons from the U.S. stockpile, and the other is the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, USAI, which funds long-term weapons contracts. The USAI money has all been spent, but the Pentagon has overstated the value of weapons sent to Ukraine, leaving them with a store credit of around $4.4 billion. While the credit exists, there may not be enough stock on the Pentagon shelves to provide the smaller aid packages. Congressional funding to buy weapons to replace those sent to Ukraine is now down to about $1 billion, raising concerns that the U.S. military will not have enough weapons to defend the American homeland. Support for Ukraine funding has been waning among lawmakers who see the war as taking funding from domestic needs. Why the world should still worry about dirty bombs. Foreign Affairs. The threat of radiological weapons, also known as dirty bombs, is growing as tensions between major powers increase and the norm against nuclear weapons weakens, warns James E. Doyle, an analyst at the nonprofit organization Plowshares Fund. Historically, several major countries including the US and the Soviet Union have developed radiological weapons, and with the recent erosion of the taboo against nuclear weapons use, there is concern that the dangers of radiological arms proliferation may be growing once again. Russian disinformation about a covert Ukrainian radiological weapons program has brought renewed attention to the issue, and the war in Ukraine has revived interest in the risks of radiological weapons. Doyle calls for action to mitigate the risks, including legally binding restraints on the production and use of radiological weapons, the adoption of non-proliferation and non-use commitments, and the creation of radiological weapons-free zones. China launched secret space plane as U.S. rival remains grounded. South China Morning Post. China has successfully launched its secret reusable experimental spacecraft for the third time, while the U.S. Space Force's X-37B has experienced multiple delays. The Chinese spacecraft was launched atop a Long March 2F rocket and will carry out technical tests and space science experiments to support the peaceful use of space. The U.S. counterpart, the X-37B, remains grounded due to poor weather and launch site issues. The X-37B's future could be strengthened due to competition from China, according to Chief of Space Operations General B. Chance Saltzman. Taiwan's presidential candidates at loggerheads over submarines. Nikkei Asia. Taiwan's opposition Kuomintang, KMT, has questioned the cost of the government's plan to build a fleet of domestically produced submarines. The KMT has pledged to open an investigation into the project if it wins power in next month's presidential election. The dispute highlights an area of disagreement between the KMT and the ruling Democratic Progressive Party over Taiwan's defense policy. Brand new trains sprayed with rocks, shattering dozens of windows. The Sydney Morning Herald. Sydney Trains is investigating how 28 windows on 3 of its new intercity trains were shattered by rocks and other debris. The rail operator has ruled out malicious behavior and speculation that the windows shattered due to extreme heat. The investigation has concluded that nearby vegetation works caused airborne rock debris to hit and shatter the windows. The new intercity fleet has faced other issues, including braking problems and crew doors opening suddenly. The fleet will undergo testing before entering service between Sydney and Newcastle in the second half of 2024. Trump and Jack Smith are both citing Richard Nixon. Here's why. Washington Post. The Supreme Court is considering whether Donald Trump has immunity from indictment over his actions during the January 6, 2021, insurrection. Special counsel Jack Smith argues that Trump's presidential immunity does not extend to the criminal justice system. Trump's legal team argues that it does. Both sides cite Richard Nixon to support their arguments. Smith cites United States v. Nixon, the 1974 decision requiring Nixon to comply with a criminal subpoena for his White House tapes in the Watergate scandal. Trump's legal team cites Nixon v. Fitzgerald, the 1982 case giving the president absolute immunity from at least one type of judicial process. The Supreme Court has never ruled on whether the president has immunity from criminal prosecution. The Constitution states that the president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. Smith argues this means presidents are subject to criminal prosecution as a separate proceeding from impeachment, while Trump's team argues it means presidents are only subject to criminal prosecution if they have been convicted and removed in an impeachment trial. Senate passes bill for promotions back pay after Tuberville holds end. Yahoo! The Senate voted Thursday to approve legislation granting back pay to senior military officers who had promotions delayed by Senator Tommy Tuberville, Republican Alabama, during his months-long hold. The bill unanimously passed Thursday provides a retroactive effect date for the promotions of senior officers. It still requires the House to approve it, and likely won't happen until 2024 since the House adjourned for its holiday break Thursday. North Korea may test ICBM this month to ramp up threat to U.S. Bloomberg. North Korea could test launch an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, capable of reaching the U.S. mainland this month, a high-ranking South Korean security official has said. Principal Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Tae-hyo explained that such a test would allow North Korea to demonstrate to its people that its nuclear arsenal has been strengthened enough to attack the U.S., and that expansion was necessary to prevent an invasion by American forces. The last time North Korea tested an ICBM was in July, when it fired its new solid-fuel Hwasong-18. U.S. presses Israel on civilian deaths, move to lower-intensity war in Gaza. Al Jazeera. The U.S. has increased pressure on Israel to reduce civilian casualties in Gaza, urging the country to shift to a lower-intensity war against Hamas. President Joe Biden called on Israel to be more careful and focus on saving civilian lives. The comments came as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan visited Israel to discuss conditions for transitioning to more targeted military operations in Gaza. The U.S. wants to see the war end as soon as possible, but Hamas has the ultimate responsibility for ending the conflict, according to White House spokesman John Kirby. New U.S. ballistic missile costs risk project termination. Japan Times. The U.S. Air Force's Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, ICBM, program, known as the Sentinel Project, is at risk of exceeding its initial cost estimate by a significant amount. The project, which aims to replace the Minuteman III missiles, was initially estimated to cost $96 billion. However, it is now projected to cost around $117 billion for the 659 missiles planned. This increase in cost could trigger a review of the project and potentially lead to its termination. The Sentinel project is part of the U.S.'s efforts to modernize its nuclear weapons capabilities and counter China's expanding arsenal. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world, here to bring you the latest news updates from around the globe. We've had quite an interesting mix of stories today, so let's dive right in. First up, we have the ongoing saga of how the U.S. keeps funding Ukraine's military, even as it claims to be out of money. President Joe Biden recently announced a new military aid package worth $200 million for Ukraine, raising questions about the availability of funds. It turns out that there are two pots of money for weapons and security assistance specifically for the war in Ukraine. One is the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which provides weapons from the U.S. stockpile, and the other is the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which funds long-term weapons contracts. While the USAI money has all been spent, the Pentagon has overstated the value of weapons sent to Ukraine, leaving them with a store credit of around $4.4 billion. So, while the credit exists, there may not be enough stock on the Pentagon shelves to provide the smaller aid packages. Looks like they're trying to stretch those military dollars. Next, we turn our attention to the threat of dirty bombs. With tensions between major powers increasing and the norm against nuclear weapons weakening, the danger of radiological weapons is growing. Historically, several major countries, including the US and the Soviet Union, have developed radiological weapons, and there are concerns that the risks of proliferation may be on the rise once again. Recent disinformation about a covert Ukrainian radiological weapons program has brought renewed attention to the issue. Analysts are calling for action to mitigate these risks, including legally binding restraints on the production and use of radiological weapons, non-proliferation commitments, and the creation of radiological weapons-free zones. Let's hope we can keep the radiological genie in the bottle. In space news, China has successfully launched its secret reusable experimental spacecraft for the third time, while the U.S. Space Force's X-37B remains grounded due to poor weather and launch site issues. Looks like China is taking the lead in the space race for now. But never fear, our Chief of Space Operations, General B. Chance Saltzman, believes that competition from China could actually strengthen the future of the X-37B. Let's hope they can get it off the ground soon and give China a run for their money. Shifting our focus to Taiwan, the presidential candidates are at loggerheads over the government's plan to build a fleet of domestically produced submarines. The opposition Kuomintang, KMT, has questioned the cost of the project and has pledged to investigate if they win power in the upcoming election. Looks like defense policy is a sticking point between the KMT and the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. Let's hope they can come to an agreement and keep Taiwan's defense strong. In Australia, Sydney Trains is investigating how 28 windows on their brand new intercity trains were shattered. It turns out that nearby vegetation works caused airborne rock debris to hit and shatter the windows. Now that's what I call an unexpected hazard. The new trains have also faced other issues, including braking problems and crew doors opening suddenly. Let's hope they can work out all the kinks before these trains go into service. Now, let's talk legal battles. The Supreme Court is considering whether Donald Trump has immunity from indictment over his actions during the January 6 insurrection. Special counsel Jack Smith argues that Trump's presidential immunity does not extend to the criminal justice system, while Trump's legal team argues that it does. Both sides are citing Richard Nixon to support their arguments. Ah, the good old days of Watergate. Looks like the Supreme Court has a lot on their plate with this one. In the U.S. Senate, a bill has been passed to grant back pay to senior military officers who had their promotions delayed by Senator Tommy Tuberville. The bill still requires approval from the House, but it looks like those officers will finally get the recognition and compensation they deserve. Better late than never. Turning our attention to North Korea, a high-ranking South Korean security official has warned that the country may test-launch an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, capable of reaching the U.S. mainland this month. The official explains that such a test would allow North Korea to demonstrate the strength of its nuclear arsenal and prevent an invasion by American forces. Looks like tensions are escalating once again on the Korean peninsula. Let's hope cooler heads prevail. Lastly, we have the U.S. pressuring Israel to reduce civilian casualties in Gaza and transition to a lower-intensity war against Hamas. President Joe Biden has called on Israel to be more careful and focus on saving civilian lives. It seems the U.S. is eager to see an end to the conflict, but Hamas ultimately holds the responsibility for ending the violence. Let's hope for a peaceful resolution in the region. And there you have it, folks. That's a wrap for today's news updates. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on these stories. What do you make of the U.S. funding Ukraine's military? Are you worried about the threat of dirty bombs? And how do you feel about China's space ambitions? Join the discussion and let me know your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the 6 Degrees world. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.